Round 1 of the Tata Steel chess tournament is now complete, and this is my game of the day, played between Jan-Krzysztof Duda and Duda Rapport. Now these guys are two of the most exciting players on the scene right now. They love to attack, they love to mix it up, so this game was always going to be exciting, very likely to bring some bloodshed, and it didn't disappoint. So Duda kicked off with d4 here, and we had knight f6 in response. And if you love a daily chess video, by the way, then do hit that subscribe button, never miss a future video. So Duda goes in for this London system now. So after these opening moves, he goes bishop to f4 here. You don't see so much of this at the Super GM level because it's quite easy for black to equalise in these structures. But okay, it's a game of chess. And now we had c4 from white. Slightly unusual when you play the London because often white sets up this pawn triangle with these pawns sitting here. But okay, c4 was played, kind of bringing it back into Queen's Gambit territory. Now we had pawn to e6, e3, knight b to d7, and queen to b3 now from Duda. So he immediately activates the queen and attacks this b pawn, but it's not such a big threat to take there because if you do, then the rook comes to the b file very quickly and you can pick up this one in return. So instead black goes bishop to d6, ignoring that threat. You could now take here as white, and after recaptures you've given black the double pawns, but it's not such a big deal. Say white takes here, well then we recapture with the knight, and we can soon move that knight out of the way and then push this pawn to d5 at the right moment. And if instead you leave these doubled pawns like this and place a knight to c3, well then black can take here, and again this one will be coming soon enough. So it's not such a big deal, and instead Duda retreats the bishop to g3. Now we had d takes on c4. That wasn't forced, you could have castled there or taken the bishop on g3. But the idea that Rapport is setting up here is that after the bishop captures, now he plays rook to b8. And he's trying to take advantage of the fact that this bishop now sits on c4 and is ready to have a tempo picked up on it. So after knight to c3, here we see the point. Pawn to b5, great move. Now you can't capture this pawn with either of your minor pieces, or else either a6 or c6 is coming at the right moment. That piece would be pinned to the queen by the rook and you're losing a piece. So instead the bishop drops back to e2. Now we had castles, and rook to d1 here from white. The knight could have planted itself immediately on e5 there, that's where you want to put this knight. But first the rook comes to the d file, which is very likely to open soon through either this break or this break. So we had queen e7 from Rapport stepping off the line, and now knight to e5. And now the game gets really sharp with potential queen sacrifices in the air. So pawn to b4 was played by Rapport, ignoring the fact that the knight can jump into c6. Now this didn't happen, but if it had happened, then we would have had a line like this. So the pawn would capture here, uncovering this attack on the queen by the rook. This knight can take the queen with check, so the bishop has to recapture. Now the queen has to move away because it's attacked, so it would come into say c4. And now you take on b2 with that pawn, and you can't actually stop this pawn from queening. So bishop to d3 is the best move, blocking this diagonal, and we would have had a line like this with queens, rook captures, rook takes, bishop recaptures, and the bishop takes here. Now this is technically a bit better for white. White has the queen, but black has three minor pieces for it, we note. And who knows what's going on in this position, and I can see why Duda didn't go in for this, just running it back now. Because for all he knows, this is Rapport's prep, and you don't want to be wandering straight into someone's prep. So rather than go in for all that, instead he played knight to a4 here, just trying to keep a lid on the tactics. So now there is this genuine threat, and black had to chop this knight, which he does with the bishop. The pawn recaptured, and now this knight came into e4. You don't want to come to d5, or f3 is a bit uncomfortable preparing e4. So the knight came into e4 here. Now we had f3 from Duda, a nice move. So although you allow this bishop to be taken like this, the pawn recaptures, you're making a nice home for the king on f2, and you're preparing e4 here with that f3 move, trying to shut this bishop out of the game. And now black can take this pawn on e5 here, that is genuinely on prise, but I think Rapport was a bit afraid of a line like this, pushing the bishop back and then pawn to f4, pushing the knight back. And white's gained some nice space in the centre. This knight might be coming into c5 soon, say the queen drops into e3 now. There's some nice dark squared pressure, the rook might come to c1 here. I can see why he didn't go for this. Instead he went for this line where instead of taking the pawn, he played knight to c5. Taking is forced here, the queen recaptures, and this is what he was calculating, that he can now pick up with the queen. You can go f4 here as white, but it's a little bit ugly. You give black extra time now that isn't available in the game continuation. So after this rook move, black is now challenging the d-file. White still isn't castled, it's a bit uncomfortable. So instead of this, Duda chucked a pawn here. These super GMs, they love the initiative. So he plays king f2, sorting out his king safety, and after the queen took the pawn here, yes, black is a pawn up, but now look at this invasion. Rook to d7. And you can't just challenge the d-file immediately, or after takes, rook recaptures, this pawn is dropping on b4. This is the problem. So instead of this, black played pawn to a5, protecting that pawn, but now the other rook comes across just in time, and this domination of the d-file is now really uncomfortable for black. So Rapport now goes pawn to h5 here. He's seeking to break open this white king position and generate some counterplay. We had pawn to e4 now, the bishop dropped back, and rook 1 to d2 is a nice prophylaxis move, defending this rank, freeing up the queen for future activity. Pawn to h4 now, the pawn captured here, and queen to h2, this is the point, you're picking up that pawn. And bishop to f1's a nice concept from Duda now, so after the pawn drops with check, he can go pawn to g3 here. Now you could check on h2, but Rapport didn't do this, because after the bishop blocks, although this bishop's pinned and it's not quite in the game right now, the black queen is also tied up, and you're better off having a bishop tied up than a queen, so it's not so great for black here. So instead of this, Rapport drops the queen back into h5 here, but what we'll see now is it's just really easy for white to slowly improve the position. So the queen came to e3, the pawn came to c5, black starts pushing these pawns, but what we'll see is it's very difficult for the pieces to actually get active because this d-file is dominated. So the structure gets locked up now over these last few moves. We had queen e5 centralizing, but queen f4 is a great move, because after these pieces come off and the pawn recaptures, white just has all the pressure here down the d-file, as we can see, even though white is down a pawn. So we had bishop to h5 now, eyeing this f3 pawn, trying to keep the king honest, king to g3, pawn to g6, and rook 2 to d3 now, protecting this pawn and freeing up the king. The rook came to e8 here. It's really difficult for black to do anything but shuffle in this position. King to h4, king to g7, king to g5. Beautiful king walk here, reminiscent of Nigel Short versus Jan Timman, not quite the same. King to h8, rook to h8 rather. Rook to c7 here, attacking this pawn. And now this part of the game really puzzles me. So we had rook to c8, holding this pawn. The rook came back. This rook kept chasing it around to try and trade off. The rook came back to d7. The rook came to f8 now, and the rook came back to c7. So what I don't understand here is why Rapport didn't play this move rook to c8. And if anyone has any insight on this, I'd really appreciate it. I just do not understand it. Keep chasing that rook, force it back to here. If you bring this rook down, doubling here and attacking, threatening bishop e6, then you can take, and this pawn's actually dropping, and this is actually pretty good for black. So you can't play like that as white. So I really don't know what white would have actually done here. But instead of this, after rook to c7, Rapport goes rook to h8, and now we had the other rook doubling on the file, the rank even, and the game is just completely gone now. So the rook came back to f8, defending this weak point, but now f5, a clinical breakthrough, and here Rapport actually resigned, because if you capture with this pawn, this is a devastating breakthrough. And if you capture with this pawn, well, your bishop is hanging. Actually, best is takes first. And if the bishop captures here, well, again, this pawn capture is just crushing. Everything's falling apart now for black. So very instructive from Duda on chucking a pawn for the initiative and dominating the open file. If you enjoyed this video, then do smash that subscribe button to never miss another one, and see another epic chess game, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.